People could be forgiven for thinking that Australian cinema started with the Ozploitation boom of the 1970s, but that's far from the truth. Australian cinema, like the Australian climate, has a history of crippling droughts followed by impressive floods. Historically, we either got a lot of films or none at all. However, if it wasn't for the tyranny of distance, Australia might have been a powerful player in world cinema. The Story of the Kelly Gang in 1906 was not only our first feature film, but it was, at slightly over an hour, the longest movie in the world at that time. Up until the mid-1930s, Australia produced dramas, comedies, musicals and historical epics in great numbers. In the 1930s, Hollywood studios started bribing the eminently corruptible state and federal governments of Australia to give economic advantage to their product, but that's a story for another video. Welcome to Terry Talks Movies, and this is the first half of a two-part series of 10 Australian movies you need to see. Australia's first feature film to be shot in colour is both important and quite problematic. It was important because it was the first time mainstream Australian culture addressed Indigenous issues in a meaningful way. It's problematic because of the way it did that. Jeddah, played by Rosalie Kurnoth-Monks, who has since become a respected First Nations elder and activist, is a woman raised by a white family in a remote cattle property in the Northern Territory. Mrs. McMinn, played by Betty Suttor, who raises her, believes in assimilating First Nations Australians into white culture.
But I still think it's our duty to try and do something with them. Bring them closer to our way of living.
Jeddah has a strong affinity for and curiosity about her people's culture, which is thwarted by Mrs. McMinn. When Marbuk, played by Robert Tatawali, becomes a stockman on the station, he's attracted to Jeddah and kidnaps her. Pursued by a part Indigenous stockman called Joe, played in blackface, which is another problematic thing, by Paul Raynal, Marbuk takes Jeddah to his people's country. He is rejected because he has a woman who is from a taboo skin group. All of this leads to a tragic confrontation on a cliff top. Shot in beautiful, austere landscapes in the Northern Territory, Jeddah was the first film to star Indigenous Australians and to take them seriously as people. For all its flaws, it is the start of a national conversation that we're still having with our First Nations.
We're a weird mob, that is what they say. We're a weird mob because we like our grog and play.
John O'Grady's comic novel, written under the pseudonym Nino Carlotta, was a big hit in Australia. It was a love letter to immigration and multiculturalism and friendship. Michael Powell, who directed some of the best British films of the 40s and 50s, gave us a humorous, energetic and vivid film about a stranger in a strange land. Nino, a sports journalist played by Walter Chiari, moves to Australia from Italy to work in his cousin's Italian-language newspaper, which has just folded. In order to make a living, he works as a builder's labourer with a crew of roughneck Australians, including Ed Devereaux, John Mellion and Slim de Grey.
No, we can't have him taking off his coat. Nor his tie either. The neighbours would think we're a lot of common workmen.
Through them, he learns about Australian culture and learns about his new home.
How do I look? I don't give a bugger how you look, come on.
Nino meets Kay, played by Claire Dunn, and starts courting her in spite of her stern and scary father, played by Australian acting legend Chips Rafferty. Sydney has rarely looked better on film. This movie celebrates friendship, inclusion, and all of the better angels of Australian culture. At times it's comically over the top, and at other times it's quite sweet and even romantic. It gives us a reassuring self-image of Australia, which isn't the whole truth, but is definitely a part of it.
It's the best place in Australia. Everybody likes the yabba.
This 1970 movie, directed by Ted Kotcheff, is the other side of the coin from They're a Weird Mob. Based on a novel by Kenneth Cook, Wake in Fright gives us a teacher, John Grant, played by Gary Bond, who works reluctantly in a remote outback school. On his way to Sydney for the Christmas holidays, he stops at the town of Bundan-Yabba, known as the Yabba. He meets a lot of the yokels and is almost suffocated by their hospitality. He loses all of his money in a 2-up game, gets drunk and spirals into a nightmare of aggressive friendliness, a brutal kangaroo cull, and a tangle of strange relationships with the locals, including Doc, played brilliantly by Donald Pleasance, and the menacing local police sergeant, played by Chips Rafferty.
You clever blokes never like to stop in the one spot long, do you?
This movie gives us the anti-intellectual, tribal, angry side of Australian masculinity, where work hard, play hard becomes something much more dangerous and soul-destroying. It's a Dorian Gray portrait of mid-century life in the outback. Filmed in the mining town of Broken Hill, Wake in Fright gives us harsh landscapes and even harsher people. It's an ugly ride, but an unforgettable one. It's another story about a stranger in a strange land, but the ending isn't quite the same.
There's a track winding back to an old-fashioned shack along the road to Gundagai.
In the past, so much of Australian cinema was about defining what being an Australian means. Newsfront does this through the lens of a newsreel production team between 1948 and 1956, a time when Australia began to change into the modern era. Bill Hunter, in the best role of his career, plays Len Maguire, a newsreel guy living through and documenting post-war immigration, natural disasters, political conflicts, and the advent of television.
Good evening, and welcome to television.
Len is that rarity in movies, a genuinely good person. We see those 8 years through the eyes of Len, his family and his co-workers, and the supporting cast is superb. It includes Wendy Hughes, Angela Punch McGregor, Chris Hayward, Gerard Kennedy, and Brian Brown. Director Philip Noyce blends real newsreel footage with his actors, and he does it superbly. The cinematography, production design, set decoration, and costume design are all first class. Newsfront asks some questions about how we navigate through change and how we become and stay our best selves. This episodic, funny, tragic, and thoughtful movie is a must-see. What happens when you mash up a revenge western with Paul Bartel's Death Race 2000, Mad Max, the original, the one they dubbed with septic tank accents when it was first released in the USA. In Australian slang, Mad Max was rough as guts, filmed guerrilla style without permits by first-time feature director George Miller. Mad Max had its post-production and all of the editing and sound mixing done in the bedroom of an apartment in North Melbourne. But the movie benefits from that roughness. The dystopian world of Max Rokitansky comes alive because Miller used the wide, straight road southwest of Melbourne, which is where I live. And partly because the stunt team led by the legendary Grant Page is pretty much insane. Max was Mel Gibson's breakout role, which may be a good or a bad thing depending on how you feel about Mel Gibson. The supporting cast was variable, but Hugh Keys-Byrne, Roger Ward, Joanna Samuel and Steve Bisney are the standout players here. While it wasn't the first exploitation movie, Mad Max is the one people think of when they use that term. It's rough, brutal, and for the time extremely shocking. It was an important part of Australian film history and has given us probably the best franchise that ever came out of this brown, unpleasant land. But the unpolished nature of the original really does hit that 1970s drive-in movie vibe right in the guts. So thank you for watching. I will be doing the second part of the 10 Australian movies you must see, taking things right up into the modern era. If you like this video, please think of subscribing, and when you've thought about it, actually do it. You can also hit the like button and get notifications through the bell. I'll be back in a week with the second part of this series, taking things right up to the modern times. In the meantime, look after yourselves, and I'll be back very soon.